back in. Well, I appreciate you guys jumping on, working through the hiccups with us. Katie, I'll have you introduce yourself really quick. Pastor Duncan, I'm sure everyone knows you, but if you would like to introduce yourself, you can do that as well. But I'm Erica Sanders, founder and executive director of You Yes You Project.
I am Katie Kelsey, and I am the Chief Legal Officer of Kids Voice, and I'm the Director of the Children's Law Center.
And I am Pastor Corey Allen Duncan Sr., the Senior Pastor of the City of Hope Community Church, and just pleased to be able to partner with Erica in this wonderful organization that God has blessed her to start.
I appreciate that. We'll jump right into it. Everyone knows that this particular law is focusing on parental rights of incarcerated parents, fathers in particular, and also formerly incarcerated parents. And I know one of the number one questions that I get, Kelsey, is like a blanket question that parents want to know is, what are my parental rights if I am incarcerated? So if you can sort of maybe break that down in general terms.
Well, I think actually a really good place to start is just talking about parental rights. And generally, Indiana assumes that it's in a child's best interest to be in the custody of their parent or their parents. You know, there are some things that could change that, like parents may divorce or otherwise separate, which would cause some kind of need for a shared custodial arrangement. One or both parents could become unable to care for a child, which would mean that a third party, like a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or even a family friend, would need to step in and help provide care. Or there could be some kind of issue of child abuse or neglect that would result in the state needing to step in. But there's no one way a family can really look, and there's no one right way for a family to function. So we all kind of have to roll with the circumstances that we're given. But even with all the things that life could throw at us, the general starting place to keep in mind is that unless a parent's parental rights have been ended or terminated in some way through adoption or through a termination of parental rights case, a parent has these really strong constitutional rights to their child. These rights can be limited for the safety of a child, but the starting place is the assumption that a parent has the right to care, custody, and control of their child. And really simply, that just means that you have the right to raise your child or share in the raising of your child, to make decisions, to spend time with them, to communicate with them. And it's a right, but it's also a duty. So those rights of care, custody, and control come with the duties of providing support, providing necessities, providing safety and stability. And when those duties aren't being done, that's when rights end up getting limited. So that was kind of like a broad overview of parental rights generally. And those things can change depending on, a parent's incarceration. Certainly things are more limited in a parent's ability to interact when they're incarcerated, but things sometimes change too once a parent has been released from incarceration. So there are some, steps and things that parents need to consider.
And that was another question that we received was, I've been released from prison, right? I've been sort of on this straight path, trying my best to do the right thing. How do I get my parental rights back if they've been taken away from me or even limited? Because I was incarcerated. So what sort of avenue can parents go to go that route?
So that's where lawyer speak is different than I think normal people speak, because when a lawyer hears I had my rights taken away, lawyers are like, does that mean your rights were terminated? Or does that just mean that you didn't get to see your kids for some time? Because if your rights were terminated, unless you're working, with the public defender through the appeals process, that's pretty much an irreversible thing. But if it's just custody was changed because a parent was incarcerated, but their rights weren't terminated, then you can go about reestablishing a relationship with your child through reestablishing contact, reestablishing visitation, and if the time comes, then asking for some kind of modification of custody. Modifications of custody generally in any kind of case, even if a parent hasn't been incarcerated. They deal with a child's best interest really heavily. So they look to see like what's changed in what we call the best interest factors in Indiana. And those best interest factors are things that deal with, the child's age, the child's relationship with the school and the community, how the child does within the family, the child's, other family relationships, if there's any patterns of domestic violence. So the best interest factors try to take into account a whole lot of things. And in order to get a modification, courts like to look at that and see, like, where has this changed? Because the goal for a child is stability. So they don't want to just modify things based on a parent's change. They want it to be like something has changed for this child, and that requires a change in custody. So it's a little more complicated than just something changed in my life, so I want to change how my custody arrangement is with my kids. It has to be something that changed for the kid.
So let me ask you this, sort of piggybacking off of that. So let's say a parent, not even a father, even it's a mother, and she's released, or he or she's released from prison, and those sort of factors have happened in the child's life. What are some of the steps, or maybe the way that maybe attorneys might advise them if they want to eventually get custody or get their rights, back with their kids? What are some of the steps or the avenues that they can take to sort of maybe show, a judge that the best interest for that kid is to be with them?
Well, I think it actually starts with kind of being cognizant of your relationship with the child while you're incarcerated, and trying to the extent that you can to maintain contact with them. Visitation while incarcerated is something that we can talk about. It's not necessarily a given that it will happen, but that kind of helps that relationship. Cards, phone calls, letters, attempts to contact, those things all matter to kids. So really, I think it's a hard thing that really any parent, regardless of their status, has to always try to think about and do, and kind of take yourself outside of your own self and your own wants, and think about, like, what is going to be best for my kiddo and for my relationship with my kid right now. And those are it's so fact dependent, and it depends so much on the kids and the circumstance that it's hard to say, like, do X, Y, and Z, because you need to know your own child, and you need to know your own situation and the situation your child is in, and kind of make judgments from there of, like, what's going to be best for my kid. So it's really just constantly keeping in mind, like, the best interest of the child.
Well, and that's interesting, and that's actually sort of good news in a way, considering the work that UESU does, just trying to connect incarcerated fathers with their kids, that to be able to go to the fathers and say, even the work you're doing right now while you're incarcerated, with the visitation that you mentioned, and sort of the education that we're providing, and the letter writing that they're already doing, that they're kind of already working towards that, if that's their ultimate goal. The work that you're doing now, even while incarcerated, it does matter. And I think that sometimes maybe they might feel as if it doesn't matter. So what you're saying is that it does.
It does matter. And, I've been doing this area of law since 2009. So I've seen lots of ends of the spectrum. And I've seen times where parents come out of being incarcerated and they haven't made, or haven't been able to make, for whatever reason, an effort to stay in contact with their child. And it's like starting from ground zero, and trying to rebuild this relationship in usually some highly restrictive, kind of awkward and uncomfortable situation, like a supervised visitation. And I've seen parents who, were able to have regular face-to-face visits. It just wildly depends on circumstances as to whether or not you can do that. But, those relationships, the parents who are able to maintain any level of contact, it's just easier to come out. It's easier to jump back into the relationship. You're not starting over with a stranger.
That's very true. That's very interesting. And that actually makes me happy because just to be able to share specifically with the fathers in our program that the work that you're doing does matter, because oftentimes I believe they feel like that it doesn't. Or even if I say to them these attempts at communication, it really does matter. So I'm happy that you brought that point up. I think that's a very important
It does. Attempts matter to kids. Contact
Yep.
matters to kids. They want to know that people care about them.
Yep, I agree. And to jump to another question that we received, and I really never quite thought about this, but if a parent is incarcerated and they do not want the non-custodial parent to take care of their child while they're incarcerated, do they have any say in that matter at all?
So that's kind of a hard one, because all the same things that I said about parental rights apply to both.
Yeah.
So Indiana presumes that a child should really be with their parents. And so most likely, as long as that other parent is okay, like that's where the child is going to be. Now there are reasons why, a parent may not be able to be available, but in those cases, somebody else is going to have to consider stepping in. And so you're looking at what's called a guardianship, which is when a third person, takes custody of a child over, the two available parents. Or there's another word for it called third-party custodianship, but I think most people use and are familiar with the term guardianship. They're basically the same thing. It's just legal jurisdiction differences.
What are some of the most common questions that you get or that you've received regarding the parental rights of incarcerated or formerly incarcerated parents that you think would be important to share?
I think probably the most common one I get, because I do, previously we were able to provide legal assistance to people, but our work recently changed and we're not able to do that anymore. So I used to get letters from parents who were incarcerated, and probably the most common question I would get was how they could have some kind of visitation or contact with their child while they were incarcerated. So there's no real automatic right for parents to have parenting time while they're incarcerated. But like I said, it's important to try to maintain contact with the child in any way possible, even if face-to-face contact isn't really possible. So there are incarcerated parents, may be precluded or prevented from visitation with children by certain statutes, depending on what type of offense they were convicted of. Like if it's a sex crime, then they may be prevented from being allowed to have any minors in the facility. But, and there's also like Department of Corrections policies that establish criteria that offenders have to meet in order for the Department of Corrections to determine if they can visit. But otherwise, in like CHINS law, so when I say CHINS, I mean child in need of services. And that's like when the state has gotten involved because of a report of child abuse or neglect. So in a CHINS case, if a parent is incarcerated, generally case plans have to detail services and treatment that's available to a parent at the facility where the parent's incarcerated, and how the child and the parent could be afforded visitation opportunities. So that's, that's something that's good. So when the state is involved because there's some kind of abuse and neglect issue, parents have some fairly delineated rights and opportunities. Now, when it's just in the context of like a divorce case or a paternity case, like where the parents were never married, it's a little more loosey-goosey. And there's not necessarily as defined of rights, but the parent who's incarcerated could always try to seek some kind of court order getting visitation or forcing face-to-face contact or phone calls or things like that.
And if they wanted to do that, what would be the first step? Let's say if they didn't have an attorney, do you know of, I know Kids Voice, and maybe you can speak to that, but maybe Kids Voice and some other organizations that they might be able to reach out to if they have additional questions or need a little bit of guidance?
So I'm not sure currently what's available, in terms of like the the law libraries that are available. But there may be something along those lines of forms that they could fill out. A lot of times, people just kind of fill out any kind of form they can get their hands on and say, hey, I want to have some kind of contact, and just send it to the court. Any public defender that people have might be able to help them with that, or at least tell them where they can turn to get that kind of help. So that's another option as well.
And another question I have for you, Katie, if there's a parent that's incarcerated and their child is in foster care, and that foster family is looking to adopt this particular child, do the parents have any say so in that matter, any rights in that matter, or because they're incarcerated, are they kind of out of luck, for lack of better words?
Oh, adoption law is so interesting and complicated, and
it all seems complicated.
That's something why I was kind of emphasizing the importance of contact with a child, because one of the consequences of a lack of contact with a child can be it can affect an adoption. So adoptions generally require the consent of both living parents. And then there is pages and pages and pages of exceptions to that requirement of both parents' consent. One of those exceptions is a lack of contact for a certain period of time. So that's why just constant efforts to try to contact a child, or remaining in contact with a child, can be really important for parents and for the child. So yeah, incarceration itself isn't a reason that consent for an adoption isn't required, but certainly some of the byproducts of incarceration can be a problem. One of the other things that is a ground for not needing a parent's consent is something called unfitness. So if a parent is deemed unfit, that could potentially be a ground for an adoption to move forward without a parent's consent. And that's so nebulous. There's no real definition for it. But it tends to be pretty extreme things.
Yeah.
Like abusing a child would be one thing.
One of the reasons. Yeah, I could definitely see that. Pastor Dunk, I didn't want to leave you out. If you've been kind of listening in the conversation, if you had any questions for Katie before I kept going.
Oh, you good? I'm just enjoying the discussion, working the back end. I do want to encourage people to ask questions. If they're on here, they can definitely ask questions. And if they do, I can post them and we can answer them accordingly.
Okay. And I know we'll chit chat just a couple more minutes, because I know we got on late, and I know Pastor Duncan, you're going to educate yourself a little bit after this live. And Katie, I know you have some things to do. I just, I guess we've been talking a lot about contact. And so again, if a parent is incarcerated and they are released and they are trying to get custody of their kid, and there was a question as far as court orders, if there's court orders in place, they're wanting to know, again, what are some of the steps if they disagree with the court order? Are they able to have any rights if they haven't been around, if they've been incarcerated and there's this court order for their kid? Do they have any rights to attest it at all?
So when a court issues an order, you have a certain amount of time to do what's called appealing it. And that pretty much requires a lawyer. It's a process of going from what we call the trial court level, the court where the judge made the decision, and then going up to the next court, which we call the appellate court, where they look at that other court's decision and say, this was correctly decided, this was incorrectly decided, or this is not something that we should really be looking at. There's a whole host of things they can say. So that's when you disagree with a decision that was fairly recently made. If a decision is really old and you disagree with it, your best bet is going to be to try to present new evidence and say things have changed and ask to modify the court order. So it's either you immediately disagree and you try to take action about it, or you just got to wait until circumstances change and ask for a change.
Well, and that's even important to know too. Again, just what your options are. So even you saying if it's the court order is kind of old and you just want to present new evidence, that new evidence could be the contact that you had with your child and the way that you've been trying to communicate and the efforts that you've been making to establish paternity, even if it's just trying to become a better person during incarceration and after. It's sort of again of a benefit if you're trying to get your rights restored or custody increased or what have you. So that consistent communication and that consistent contact seems to be sort of the key factors in this situation.
It is. And, I very much come at this from, my own practice and my own experience, which is advocating for children and representing their best interests. So that's always my viewpoint and where I come from. And just what I've seen throughout the years is that kids just want their parents to be involved with them and to love them and to find a way to work together. And maybe that doesn't mean, working hand in hand, side by side. Maybe that just means staying out of each other's business and figuring out a way to parent but stay in their own lanes. But kids want a family, whatever that family looks like.
Yeah. And we'll end this with, I have just sort of speaking on that topic. When you say that dealing with this and just the best interest in the kids, what, as an attorney, if you can speak to this, what are some of the factors aside from the communication and the constant contact that we've mentioned before that parents can kind of, focus on if they want to, again, get rights restored or custody, what have you? What are some of the things that you might look at or attorneys might look at or judges might look at specifically on the best interest of the child?
Well, probably the best thing to look at is the actual statutes on what the best interests of the child are. So the best interest factors are the age of the child, the sex of the child, the wishes of both parents. So the parents' wishes are relevant. The wishes of the child with more weight given to those wishes once the child turns 14. That doesn't mean the child gets to pick once they turn 14. It just means that we give them a lot of consideration once they turn 14. The child's how well the child is embedded in the school and the community, how the child is doing educationally, the child's interactions with family members and other relevant people in the house, whether there's a pattern of domestic violence, how the communications are between the parties, between the parents, and whether or not there's what's called a de facto custodian, meaning is there somebody else who's actually taking care of this child and it's not either parent? Like, is grandma the one that the child is living with and it has been living with for years? That's a de facto custodian.
Gotcha. Okay. I think that's helpful to know because oftentimes you hear best interest of the child, and it's like, well, what are those factors? What exactly are those factors? So I think that's important to know. I appreciate you, Katie, Pastor Duncan, you helping us maneuver and kind of figure out how to get this so we can at least get some information out there. And again, we will post this video, Katie. So if Kids Voice wanted to share, Pastor Duncan, I know that we're live and that you'll post it and we'll post it as well on our social media. So I really appreciate the time and the hiccups that kind of went just to get this going. So I truly appreciate that. And I hope that this conversation and some of these questions were helpful. And what I'll do as well, I'll do a little bit of research. And once I post this live, I'll include some links to some resources that some of our families can reach out to, or some frequently asked questions that they might have. So, and maybe Katie, if you can think of some of those, you might be able to send those to me, and I can post those as well. And Pastor Duncan, you can share those too. Yep. Awesome. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, we got it figured out.
Got a couple things in.
All right.
So
have a good evening.